Check.
Good evening. This is the November 18th, 2008 meetup of the Austin Constitution Meetup Group. I'm Jon Roland, and today we're going to be discussing the impact of the 2008 election and the economic meltdown on constitutional matters. We are mostly already familiar with the problems that have arisen throughout the decades, especially the last 70 or 80 years, with violations of the Constitution. But now, with the change of administration and with the economic meltdown, we can expect more pressures to be placed on constitutional compliance. And we're not only going to be having to defend the Constitution from being further usurped, but we're going to be having to defend ourselves in many cases from pressures that are likely to be put on anyone trying to defend the Constitution. Don't be misled by a constitutional instructor being in the White House. I'm not familiar with how President-elect Obama taught the Constitution when he did so at the University of Chicago, but I am familiar to some degree with how Joe Biden taught it, and he has also taught taught constitutional law, and he became a kind of laughingstock of his students. We've gotten a sense of that from his performance during the debates. And as an influence on constitutional decision-making, that's likely to be a very bad one in many ways. Now, there are several things we can look at, and particularly that have gotten a lot of attention already. The first thing is, what is likely to be the impact on the makeup of the Supreme Court? Well, based upon actuarial tables, the only members of the present Supreme Court who are likely to retire during the next 4 to 8 years are all the liberals. We need most likely Stevens, Ginsburg, Souter, and Breyer. And these, of course, were also the ones who were on the wrong side, from our viewpoint, of the recent decision in the Heller decision concerning the Second Amendment rights. Now, if any of these drop out and are replaced by similarly liberal justices, they probably won't change the makeup. The one that we still need to be concerned about is Justice Kennedy. Now, he seems to be a healthy fellow. We could normally expect him to be around for another 4 to 8 years, but there's always a possibility that he won't be. And if he is replaced, we're likely to lose the majority that we got in Heller and are likely to get in other cases. So he's the one you need to watch out for. We need to hope for his health. However, we also need to be concerned about the other courts. The Supreme Court can only take about, or has been only taking, about 80 of the 8,000 cases that are presented to it each year. Okay? 80 out of 8,000 has always suggested to me that among those 7,020 cases that are not being accepted, there's got to be some that have merit. And of course, I've examined many of them, and many of them do have merit. In fact, many of them are the most important cases that should be taken instead of the ones that are being taken, from my viewpoint. And the problem there is that they are being decided by justices at the lower levels. The appeals level is particularly critical. There are currently only 2 members of the Ninth Circuit that tend to decide in ways that are favorable to the Constitution, from my viewpoint. One of them, of course, is Justice Kaczynski. It is unlikely that we're going to be getting anyone else other than him to hold the line on many of the cases that reach the Ninth Circuit. There's also the possibility, although I suggested it at the 2005 Federalist Society Convention, that because of the bottom height, Senator Cornyn was the speaker for a plenary session of the entire membership. And of course, naturally, I was the first to the microphone. And I asked him, Senator, the Supreme Court is only taking 80 out of 8,000 cases each year. That seems to be a bottleneck. Why don't we solve the problem by increasing the size of the Supreme Court to 27? Let each case be heard initially by a randomly selected panel of 3, appealable to a randomly selected panel of 9, and from there to an en banc panel of all 27. Well, naturally he was caught as a deer in the headlights, but after a brief pause, the entire room broke out in laughter and applause, because they just realized what none of the rest of them had thought of, how if this were done under a conservative administration, it could solidify the conservative, and of course hopefully get a few libertarians in their position of the courts for the next generation or two. And of course, nobody naturally pursued that. The problem is, I don't think we can count on the new democratic regime not to do something like that themselves. And you can imagine what would happen now. In retrospect, I should have said 28 rather than 27 justices, which is the way things are done in the Ninth Circuit. The idea is to have one spare, who tends to be the presiding judge for the whole group. And if this were done, it could pretty well mean a constitutional revolution in this country, and one that does not bode well for our purposes. So we can hope that they don't get that idea. I'm not mentioning it too much anymore, but if I can think of it, other people can think of it too. Okay. Now, we can go circuit by circuit as to which circuits are particularly critical. One of them is our own Fifth Circuit. It has mostly Republican appointees, although I'm not real fond of some of them. They have a tendency, unfortunately, to decide in favor of the government whenever there is a case between a government and an individual. And that's not my idea of what they should be doing. Something can be said for progressive judges if they will side with an individual. The problem is that too many of them also side with the government against an individual. If it's not a First Amendment case or a civil rights case or a few other types of cases that are favored by their mindset. So we still don't have many justices in the federal judiciary who might be considered to have libertarian tendencies. One of the few would be someone like Janice Rogers Brown, who's currently on the D.C. circuit. Her appointment there was very important, and if we could get more like her, it would be great. So the key thing in the appointment of justices still is the U.S. Senate. Because generally speaking, the Senate still follows the rule that no one gets appointed to the federal bench over the objection of a senator from that circuit or that district. So although they might not nominate the candidate, they can block one. And therefore, there is some opportunity for input from the citizens to write letters to senators in particular, encouraging them to support someone we like for the federal bench. And one of the things we need to do in that regard is we need to start lining up candidates for the federal bench that we like and start suggesting them. The likelihood of that working is not great, but it's better than nothing. And if you go to my website, Constitutiion.org, and you go to the People page, you find that I have already assembled a list of mostly lawyers, but not entirely, scholars anyway, who would make good federal judges. And one of the things that we can all do is to try to talk them up, to generate buzz about them, to make them the subject of conversation. The more people talk about them, the more likely they are to get nominated, unless, of course, the talk is bad. So we need to organize our attention to influencing the appointment of members of the federal bench. The second major area is the kind of cases that are likely to come up before the Supreme Court, or for that matter, the lower courts. Now, we've been hearing about some of them. California's Proposition 8, for example. There are various cases that are likely to find their way to the Supreme Court, or at least to appeal, which are of interest to various constituency groups, especially social conservatives, but, of course, some to the progressives. But a lot of them are really not that important. They are cases that get a lot of public attention, And the way they get public attention is instructive, and we can learn from that. But whether or not California recognizes gay marriages, while it may be important to gays in California, it's really not going to affect that many people's lives in a substantive way. It serves as a distraction from other more important things like, does the federal government bail out California? Well, the answer is it better not, because we can't establish a precedent of the federal government bailing out every state that doesn't manage its own budget properly. And California has been really overspending. Governor Schwarzenegger is going to be given credit for trying to hold the line, but in the end he caved in because he was simply outnumbered. And now he is going to the federal government begging for money. He needs to be turned down so that he can go back to his legislature and say, look, we're not going to get any money from there. You guys have got to cut back. And there's going to be a lot of yelling and screaming, and probably a lot of people taking it out on Arnold and trying to recall him and doing other such things, but the fact that they have no choice. And other states are going to be in a similar position. Interestingly enough, it seems likely that Texas is likely not to be one of them. We're one of the few states that is actually running a surplus. Of course, one of the reasons is that we're an oil-producing state. But another reason is simply that our resources, our skills, our productivity are still relatively intact. You can see indications of the downturn here in Austin, but it's not nearly as bad here as it is in most of the rest of the country. And one of the main things that make it as bad here as it is a spillover from the rest of the country. People here are not unable to get loans for their business ventures, not because of anything wrong with the economy of Central Texas, but because the lenders are national or global institutions that don't have money to lend to anybody. So it's the old problem that when the boat develops a really bad leak, it takes everybody down with it. And in a little bit later, I'll be getting into the problem of the meltdown. Now, there are several the state legislature is currently drafting legislation for the new session. One of the things I'm doing is working on several bills. I have friends in the legislature that say they'll introduce them for me. Most of them are little things, but I want to get them accustomed to introducing little stuff for me, so they'll introduce bigger stuff for me later. And one of the things that is a bigger thing is the Real ID Act. About 27 states now have either rejected it or denounced it, and most of the rest have not yet funded it. Texas has not yet funded it. It's asked for an extension of time. And we need to go to our state legislators and say, look, it's not going to happen. Too many states have rejected it. It makes no sense for us to spend a lot of money for something that isn't going to work. It's not going to be accepted. So we want you not to fund the Real ID Act at all, but instead pass a resolution rejecting it. Now, that is going to confront the whole system, because Texas is a key state here. We're a border state, and one of the border states. And if we reject the Real ID Act, then it really is likely to fail nationwide. However, it would be useful to have an alternative. There is a objective need for identification, but we don't want is identification that's under the control of the central government, or for that matter, even the state government. The traditional method of identification are circles of trust, the traditional notary system. People who know one another and vouch for one another, but who are local or are not under central control. And one of the things that we can do is to encourage our legislators to strengthen the notary system so that circles of trust that they represent can in fact be trusted to identify people. There wouldn't be a standard identification, but there would be a network of networks of people vouching for one another and who would be to some degree held accountable if they both vouched for somebody who wasn't who he said he was. And with that kind of system in place, I think we could achieve the legitimate purposes of identification without the vulnerability to abuse of a centralized system. Ben?
Okay, why doesn't the driver's license apply to this? Because you have to have a birth certificate, which is notarized or certified somehow, to get your valid driver's license.
You haven't always had to have that.
Oh, really?
No.
I remember I had to have it when I was 16.
No.
Is that just a state proclivity?
I never had to have it when I got my driver's license. All I had to do was just pass a test.
Wow.
2 tests, written and practical.
You're older than me, son.
And I was later asked to provide my Social Security number, but I've never had to provide my birth certificate for the state of Texas.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, maybe it's a different state.
Now I do have to do. I've had to do it for my passport, which is reasonable. But until I applied for a passport, I hadn't even seen my birth certificate.
See, I had to have one to even get in the service.
Yeah, well, I seem to recall when I went into the service, they got one for me as part of my background check. But I only had to tell them where I was born, and they took care of the rest. So I never actually saw that one.
Well, that being the case, then this alternative is pretty good.
Yeah, now I've been involved in something called the THAWT, it's pronounced, T-H-A-W-T-E, which uses digital certification. In other words, you have a password known only to you, and it certifies, basically authenticates you and all your communications. You can use it for email, for your websites, for all sorts of things. And it's based upon, I'm a thought notary, which means that I can notarize other people, identify other people, and if they get identified by enough people, they become notaries, and so it becomes a network of people who all self-identify one another, or identify, not self-identify, but identify one another. It has somewhat fallen into disuse. I haven't certified anybody for a while. I'd have to go back and read up to know how to do it if I did try to do it again. But it's something, it's a kind of thing that needs to be strengthened. And if the state in particular recognized it as a valid form of identification, then it would make all the difference in the world. And the kind of difference that it needs to make. What we do not want is the Angela Bassett types of scenario, you know, from the movie and the TV series, where one person can change an entry in a computer for somebody and turn them into somebody else, or into a criminal fugitive or something like that. Although I've not had a chance to investigate it in detail, I am told that there is someone still sitting in prison in Minnesota who was only there because he was misidentified. Somebody else used his social security number. And when this error was pointed out to the prosecutor, he said, well, he confessed, he pled. And what can I do? You know, too bad. Of course, the thing is, he was intimidated into confessing and pleading, even though he was the wrong guy, because they can intimidate people that way. It illustrates, though, the problem of having that kind of control in the hands of some anonymous clerk who can just, with a few keystrokes, turn you into a wanted fugitive, cop killer, child molester, whatever. So we cannot trust that kind of power in any central identifying body, even a state. Having 50 states and several territories disperses it a little bit, but the fact is that they can all be subverted. So we need a more robust system, one in which people can have confidence, but not only to identify people, but not to be satisfied that they're not going to be misidentified. Okay, so that we've discussed the Real ID Act. That's an active one. And I'd like to discuss a few others that we need to work on. Concealed carry. Now, it says, well, we can already get permits to carry concealed. The problem is, well, when they passed the concealed carry statute, it also made it a crime to carry openly. Except that last session they passed a bill that you could carry in your vehicle. So, this is creating a confused situation. And we need to write our state legislators telling them to allow open carry. And on concealed carry, that is not an offense to momentarily conceal something or to put it in a box or container out of, so people don't know what it is. Like concealed carry means, routinely carrying it on your body, under your clothing, so nobody can tell what it is, on an ongoing basis, not just occasional or momentarily. So, allowing open carry is something we could all write our legislators about. Now, we also need to do something about voting. Right now, in Texas, as in most other states, every county decides for itself what kind of voting systems to use. We do not have adequate standards to decide whether or not voting machines have integrity. And we need to establish such standards. we need to insist on an audit trail, which really means generating a paper ballot that can be counted and recounted. Now, with the hard intercivic system that we have here in Travis County, you do generate a paper ballot, which is then scanned, so that's good in that sense. But not everyone, that isn't done for everybody, disabled people and so forth. Still get to use an all electronic device. And of course, there's still a problem with other counties in the state that don't use systems that I feel we can have confidence in. So we need to ask our legislators to establish firm standards that allow for audits of votes. Now, on the federal level, we have to decide how we're going to make a determined effort to prevent Congress from simply pumping more and more and more and more money to try to bail out, you know, every enterprise that's in danger of failing. We're getting dangerously close to the point at which our foreign lenders will stop lending to us. Always keep in mind that, first of all, the income tax on wages only produces 30% of revenues. Second of all, any of these taxes do not pay the bills of government.
You know, you're assuming, forgive me for thinking you assume anything. But you're saying income tax on wages is constitutional?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. There are a lot of taxes that are unconstitutional. This is the big one.
Yes.
But people will argue, well, the federal government needs it to pay its bills. No, it doesn't.
That's right.
Okay. Federal government creates money out of thin air. All this $700 million for the bailout, you know, they're not getting that from taxes. They haven't even gotten it from borrowing yet. Somebody still has to lend them that money. Okay, if they create money, it would be inflationary if they did not do one of two things: either tax or borrow enough to reduce the amount in circulation. Now, it's not an exact equal, because normally if the economy is growing, you want to increase the amount in circulation by about as much as the economy is growing. But if they can't borrow, and there's no way they can tax enough to cover it, because it would be essentially driving the economy into the ground to tax us that high, then we're going to have hyperinflation. How much hyperinflation? Well, based upon what they're already doing, we can there's only about $1 billion in cash in circulation. I mean, $1 trillion in cash in circulation. If you put $1 trillion more, or $2 trillion, or $3 trillion into circulation, you're looking at a hyperinflation rate, which is just not in proportion. There's actually a multiplier effect, because once inflation gets going, people start expecting more and more and more inflation. It becomes self-fulfilling. You get a runaway inflation effect. So we could expect inflation rates of 300, 400, 600, 800, 1,000%. Now, for people paying mortgages and rent on fixed leases, that sounds like a good deal. But all of a sudden it means that food, clothing, gas, utilities, everything else would shoot up. I've been sending an email around, some of you may have gotten it, in which I invite people to study the example of Argentina. In 2001, Argentina went through an economic collapse. As a result of that, it was suddenly, the standard of living in Argentina suddenly dropped from that of a semi-developed nation to a poor nation. Now, since then, they have partly climbed out of that situation. They're on their way to recovery. It's been 7 years, but they're showing definite signs of progress. And they've even paid off some of their international debt, which is what has made it possible. Now Argentina can get loans from other countries. But the odds of the United States being able to pay off its debt, if it were to default on all of its loans, is not very good. The United States may still provide the world's reserve currency, so that if it goes down, the whole world does. But if it goes down, the whole world isn't going to have any money to loan us either. So one of the things that made the situation in Argentina tolerable, or not worse than it otherwise would be, is that it was the only country in its neighborhood undergoing the same meltdown. The problem we have with the meltdown that confronts us today is it involves all of the developed countries at once, all of which have economies built on credit. And if credit fails on a global scale, we all go down. And it may not stop with the elimination of, well, investment banks are already gone, hedge funds are pretty much gone, credit default swaps are gone, all the complex derivative instruments are gone, the mortgage-backed securities are on their way out, nobody wants to touch those anymore. The problem is, where does it stop? Because the whole system was built on these tools for bringing in more money to local lenders than they could get by just making loans and carrying their own paper. It used to be a bank or a savings and loan would loan money to a homeowner. They would keep the note. They would take payments on it, put it in their accounts, and it was from that they would loan more money. But they couldn't loan more money until enough people paid back the loans that are already outstanding. So it took some time to do that. What they discovered with mortgage-backed securities is they could bundle together a bunch of these mortgages and sell the bundle as a investment vehicle itself, never mind what might be contained in it. And they could be a little bit vague about that. But they could get enough money on the sale to then go turn around and loan more money. So it became a vicious cycle, and the quality of the mortgages began to decline. What we can expect now is for housing prices generally, and this includes not just residences, but office buildings and other such structures, and for that matter, capital equipment for companies, to decline in their price to historic levels. Okay, now, what are historic levels? A house in the Austin area that's as recently as a year ago would have sold for $400,000. Would, if you projected the long-term secular trends of prices, essentially would followed inflation until about 10 years ago, when it suddenly shot up. That was a speculative bubble. If you reduce it to the level that inflation, long-term inflation, would have brought us to, then that house would probably only sell for about $100,000. And to get a sense of another way of looking at it, it used to be, and it normally would be the case, that you could buy a house, pay the mortgage on it, and turn around and rent it for enough money from the lease payments to pay the mortgage, the insurance, everything else, and make a little profit. Anyone who's gone out to either buy a house today or to rent one soon discovers that it's a lot cheaper to rent than to buy. The payments are less. And as long as the payments for rent are substantially below what the payments would be for a mortgage, the mortgages are too high. And they are what are going to have to come down in order to match that long-term, that basis for established by the rental market. So if you're paying, say, $1,200 a month for a house now, the mortgage payment on that should only be about, at most, $1,100, probably only about $800 or $900 or $1,000. And if it's higher than that, based on prevailing interest rates, then it's priced too high. Of course, the interest rates could be too high, but that's not really the main problem now. And if that is not, prices are not sustainable, if we can expect all housing prices to decline on the average about a factor of 4, then all of a sudden almost everybody with a mortgage is going to be underwater. It won't make sense for anybody to go on paying it. So we're going to have a lot more defaults. And that becomes a vicious cycle too. So suddenly all the houses in a neighborhood, all probably built about the same time, financed through the same institutions, from the same builder, are suddenly all going to become snake bit. And recovery from that situation can develop a significant latency. In other words, a lag in turning the situation around and getting things back to what they should be. So that we might actually expect prices to decline below the historic secular trend level, maybe to $50,000 on what's now $400,000 house, even lower. So So there can be some real bargains for people who have cash to invest. On the other hand, there may not be enough such people, and there could be whole neighborhoods, which mostly vacant houses, being occupied by vandals and squatters, and creating a really nasty situation. And one of the things I have been trying to encourage people to do is to organize neighborhood associations to deal with the situation. We used to be that a neighborhood association with a neighborhood watch program would be patrolling the streets, trying to keep criminals from victimizing its members. Now you may have a situation where the neighborhood watch has to protect vacant property from vandals and squatters, and fulfilling some of the purposes of that should be done by the managers. I know several houses that I'm personally familiar with that are in the position that they've gone back to the lender, and now suddenly they're not being managed anymore. Nobody mows the lawn, you know, the water bills aren't being paid, you know, it's just, you know, no telling what's going to happen at that place next. So we are going to have to organize among ourselves to deal with these problems. And of course that brings up the whole issue of militia. This Saturday, I spoke at a militia muster near Teague, Texas, most of the attendees to which were former Ron Paul people. And there's a general recognition that when things get bad, that we're not going to be able to depend on the authorities, as people in Argentina were not able to depend on, to keep order and to protect people from being victimized. So we are going to have to step in. So even though we may be spending part of our time defending the Constitution, we may also have to spend part of our time just defending our neighbors. And of course getting them to defend us. So we are entering a new era when suddenly the word militia may no longer have the connotation that it has acquired since 1995. And we need to make sure that it does, that it is recognized as we are the good guys who are trying to keep order and defend the rule of law.
Do you think the media did that on purpose, or it was just because of those guys?
No.
I guess it's the Davis Mountains things that give us a bad name, right?
No, it was Oklahoma City bombing primarily.
Okay.
Okay. And I was active during that time. You may or may not recall, but I was interviewed on Dayline NBC by Stone Phillips. It aired on April 25th.
So 95?
Yeah, in 1995. And the producers asked around, who can best speak for the militia movement, because who are being mentioned as the cause of the Oklahoma City bombing by Oliver Buck Revelle, a former FBI agent, and I would call him provocateur. So Stone flew down to Dallas, near where I was living at the time, interviewed people for about 2 hours. I opened the program, my voice opening it, saying we have to ask cui bono, who benefits. And then I laid out a very well organized spiel, which I am told by people high up in Washington caused a lot of people there to go ballistic. They weren't ready for someone to say that. So So this was a case where the mainstream media was doing their job. Of course, it helped to have someone that they could talk to who knew how to do his job. So you need to always be prepared to speak to the media. Even though they may be biased, it's better that they be biased with a little help toward sanity from us than to be allowed to proceed on their own without any input at all from us, so they can begin to conjure up all kinds of demonic imaginings. Now, during the course of that, being somewhat PR savvy, I was going systematically to the media with the malicious side of the story. And what I encountered was that there were other people out there, they call them flacks for the moment, who were doing the same thing, telling they were, let's say, the rebel version of events. And when it was sort of amusing at one point, I contacted this media person, journalist, and I got the word back from her assistant that the flack came after me to that particular journalist. And she told him, this was what was told me, Mr. Roland of the militia movement has already spoken to us about that, and his story is more convincing than yours. I never met any of these flacks. I got intimations of who they might be. They were not particularly good at it. You would think with something that important that the regime would have used more highly qualified, more skilled personnel. But actually, they didn't. They relied upon fairly low-skilled, I would call them incompetent people. They were assuming that there would be nobody on the other side, telling the other side of the story. And when I did tell the other side of the story, it proved to be fairly effective. So I did a lot of damage control during that period. But fortunately, there were not a lot of others doing that kind of damage control. And I was operating with a shoestring. I was having trouble paying the rent or the utilities, the phone bill. It was, pretty desperate. But I stuck to it, contacted one journalist after another, after another, after another. And that kind of diffused that effort on the part of the regime. Not completely, but to a large degree it did. They began to abandon their attempt to demonize the militia and focused on talk radio. Okay? And now, of course, we're hearing Senator Charles Schumer saying that talk radio is like pornography. Yeah. Now, what they have in mind is a thing called the Fairness in Media Act, which was, there used to be one, and it was repealed under Ronald Reagan. And you can see what happened before and after. Talk radio as we know it came into being after it was repealed. It didn't exist and couldn't exist before that. Now the progressives tried to do their own talk radio with their own programs to provide a leftist slant to the whole thing, spin on events. The problem is that nobody wants to call in. They don't have an audience. not enough to support the stations or the programs. So those efforts have mostly failed. But we can expect that there will be a revival of efforts to reenact the Fairness Media Act. Of course, it will only apply supposedly to broadcast media. We think that they're going to try to extend it to cable media as well, which they have traditionally not done, which will leave us essentially with the internet. Unfortunately, from their viewpoint, there is the internet. It's useful to keep one thing in mind, EICE. The internet changes everything. And if they try to pass a Fairness Act that covers all broadcast and cable media, then we're going to have to resort to the internet to counter it. But what they're likely to try to do then is to go after bloggers. Imagine a law that says that every blogger has to give equal time to all viewpoints. Okay. Well, could they get away with that? Probably not. But even trying to do it is a distraction we don't need. And we need to try to nip it in the bud. And the way we nip it in the bud is to demonize their efforts before they even get off the ground. And of course, that's already started. And interestingly enough, it's a lot of liberals that are on our side in that, the ACLU people. So we can have common ground with a lot of progressives on some issues. We just need to exploit the issues properly, form alliances with people. I was talking to about it recently, just a few days ago, with Ruth Epstein, who is the number 2 on the ACLU here in Travis County in Texas. And she mostly agrees with us. She may not agree with us all the way on every issue, but she agrees with us on so many things that we can take advantage of that agreement and to build alliances there. So every chance we have to build an alliance with anybody, we shouldn't avoid just because we disagree with them on some issue. Because we need to find areas of agreement that we can work with them on. And if we can get them accustomed to working with us on one issue, or 2 issues, or 3 issues, we can build on that. If before very long they begin to see us as more as allies than as adversaries, and may even not oppose us on the things we disagree on. So, we're going to be busy in the next 4 to 8 years. And on 2 fronts, because obviously, if we're all in bread lines, it's going to be a little bit difficult for us to be politically active. We might be guarding the farmer or the rancher or the shipment to the supermarket, or making sure the supermarket doesn't get invaded by rioters. But you know what? We may have trouble getting food for ourselves during that period. Now, I don't know about you, but I am not ready financially for this kind of downturn. Very few people I know are. Even the ones who thought they were, who had investments, are suddenly discovering that those investments aren't there anymore. Their savings, their pension funds, eventually soon their cash in their banks may disappear. A lot of people ask me what I think about investing in gold. Well, that's fine, but if you're trying to operate in a situation, a meltdown situation, following 70 years of people not using gold for currency, it can be a little bit difficult to return to gold as even a barter item, much less as some kind of currency. You may be better off using rounds of ammunition or sacks of corn or, you know, commodities that people can actually use.
Or seeds,
Yeah, because those are the because ultimately that's what people are going to want to buy with gold and
Commodities.
commodities. In particular, the key commodities are going to be food. Now, Texas is fortunate in one important respect. We can actually produce enough food in Texas to feed ourselves. There is almost no other region of the world of comparable size about whom that could be said. We can also, in principle, produce most of our own energy, even though we might haul coal from Wyoming or someplace, and we're not set up to use our own locally produced energy. In principle, if we were, we could generate most of it locally. And in fact, many of the key refineries that serve the whole world are here in Texas. Okay, when Arab ships a barrel of oil to the United States, he has to ship back a barrel of gasoline so he can run his car. All right. So the whole world has a stake in keeping us afloat. But even if they wanted to keep loaning us money, they're not going to be able to. They're going to be having to support themselves. Don't ask Iceland to float any of our to buy any of our T-bills. Okay, they're busy trying to figure out how they're going to feed their own people right now. Modern, developed country, all of a sudden, complete collapse. Savings wiped out. People are still eating because, of course, their economy basically runs on fish. But as far as, you know, being investors, that's pretty well over for them for the next decade or so. And Europe, Japan, well, Japan is now in official meltdown. Russia is actually in the stock market meltdown, which is probably a prelude to a general economic meltdown. In many ways, what we can anticipate is very much like what happened with the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union broke up, it had horribly misallocated resources. Factories, farms, you know, everything, housing, were not where they needed to be. The whole thing had been propped up by state commands. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, all of a sudden, the economy collapsed as well. Now, part of what happened, and something we need to watch out for, is that a few of the old KGB types were in a position to step in and seize major assets. So you had a new kleptocracy emerge out of the ruins of the Soviet Union, which is still where most of the contention is occurring in that country, in Russia today. So part of what we need to be on the lookout for and to guard against, to the extent that we can, is to not allow a new bunch of kleptocrats to come in and pick up the pieces. Now that happened after the savings and loan debacle. You may remember perhaps the days of about around 1985. Now I predicted that would happen. At the time, what the triggering development was closing the loopholes in the tax code for real estate investments. Well, what that had the effect of doing is reducing the market value of most real estate by just a few percentage points, 2, 3, 4%. But that was enough to reduce the equity value of most mortgages into the negative range. Because most people were heavily leveraged in their homes and so forth. And that put the savings and loan in technical, being technically unqualified to continue. It qualified for them for intervention, for coming in, seizing them, and shutting them down. Well, as a result of all that, a lot of the assets that were mortgaged by the savings and loan wound up being bought up by investors for 15, 20% on the dollar. Now, a lot of these, of course, were the banks. The banks were the ones who really were the main robbers of the savings and loans, whereas they, in turn, were then robbed themselves. With one exception, most of the small, locally owned banks I know were forced into being liquidated and sold, and now no longer exist. Now they're part of big chains. Well, I watched that happen. I predicted it would happen. It happened more or less the way I expected it would. Now, was this all part of a plan? Probably, perhaps not, but the result is the same, and we need to learn from that example. Of course, if this thing gets really bad, there won't be anybody to buy up these things at even 10, 15, or 20 cents on the dollar. We may suddenly find, like say, miles and miles of vacant houses, perhaps some effort being made to rent some of them, acres and acres of repossessed vehicles, nobody to drive them, nobody can afford the gas for them. It could get pretty rough. So if you have not already developed an urban survival strategy for the months and years ahead, this is the time to develop it. And we all need to work together to develop the survival strategy, because people can't survive by themselves, even if they're well armed. Maybe you, your wife, your kids have guns and food and other things you need. You cannot, a combat unit that small is not viable. You've got to have at least platoon level, about at least 60 people. And that needs to be part of a brigade, battalion, and so forth. So it needs to be organized at several different levels. Unless it is, you're not going to make it. You just have too many people shooting at you. So these are all things to think about. I didn't want to go too much further without opening it for questions. So if you have any questions, this would be the time to bring them up.
Would you like us to come up front and put it last time, or?
You can, yeah.
Doesn't really matter. I know I've got at least 2 questions, maybe 3. But if Jim or somebody wants to go ahead and go, that's fine. But you were talking about foreign lenders stopping lending. I was curious, and you also mentioned, of course, hyperinflation. When would you see something like that possibly happening? I mean, I know that you couldn't predict it be very, very difficult.
It could easily be within a year.
I mean, there's just not.
By the end of 2009, it could be well underway.
Okay, and you mentioned Argentina, and that the period it took them to recuperate from this was not just 1 year or two. This was many years.
Yeah, it's taken about 7 years.
But you're hearing a lot on these, for example, like the economics channels, like Fox Business or whatever. They say it's maybe a recession that's going to last maybe 2 years or so, maybe 14 months or so.
Well, they hope.
That's what they're hoping. But like you said, you can't really.
The problem is the indicators are that all of the various national bailout plans are not working. They've asked the media to keep quiet about it, but of course the word is getting out, and it's continuing to collapse. It hasn't found bottom yet. Nobody has confidence in the credit system anymore, and let's face it, money and national currency are credit instruments.
Right, that's true.
So it's not just a matter of getting to the point where nobody can get any loans. They may not be able to get any money in cash either.
Right. And you mentioned, of course, you mentioned the term urban survival last time, but then how would you advise someone to get ready for the downturn? Like if it got really bad? Are we talking like farming or something?
Stock up on food.
Uh-huh.
Make friends with somebody who has a ranch or farm.
Uh-huh. And when you're saying stock up on food, you're talking about stocking up on food, not stocking up on food for a month or so. I mean, you're for a sustained
more like a
years.
year, yeah.
More like a year. Any other advice you would have in that category?
Well, I've been sending out email messages. I can send them out again.
How about this?
There are a whole lot of people have just been putting out lists on the internet of the things you're going to need.
Right.
And most of them are pretty good lists, mostly overlapping, but there are some differences. Of course, obviously, most of us can't really afford to get everything on that list, which is another reason why we need to band together with other people, because we need to each help out the others in ways that they can't help themselves.
I've been hearing on Alex Jones, I can't think of the name of it, so I'll pay more attention to it, but for $1,200 you buy a food pack.
Well, I don't know about if that's a good deal.
It's probably MREs or something.
Yeah, you really need to be careful because there'll be a lot of scamsters out there.
Well,
trying to take advantage of the situation.
But this guy has been.
You always find them at survivalist conferences that they charge you $10 for something you can get up for $2 by yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know a friend of mine is fixing to buy a $200 and something water purifier. So
yeah. Well, that might be
going around.
You think that's too much?
I don't know. I wouldn't know what. I'm not an expert on those, so I don't want to judge it.
Well, if nothing else, you can just use a bucket and the sand.
Right.
So there are lots of ways to purify water.
Right. Well, I mean, I started a basic survival kit, and I had what do you call it? Chlorine tablets.
Yeah.
I guess you could use them. I don't know if those are any good, but
they have their uses, but they're limited.
But a bucket of sand?
You can filter water through sand.
Really?
But how much sand? That fecal count. I don't know.
Well, you have to periodically clean out and wash off the sand.
Yeah. Start collecting rainwater.
Yeah.
Anyway, what's the acronym, Tice, again? The internet what?
The internet changes everything.
oh yeah, there you go. Oh, I got a question for you. Probably this is my last question. There's this is kind of might be a silly issue, but I know you've heard about it. Obama has been there's been a case filed against him, and it's currently before the Supreme Court. Is that something worth supporting or not? Or do you think that's just a waste of time? Is that silly?
Well, obviously, if Obama is not a natural born citizen, then that's a problem.
Right.
There's not a lot we can do about it. The case has been filed.
Right.
The courts will do with it what they will.
Right.
Whether it's really before the Supreme Court or not is unclear. Unfortunately, if Obama can get past the inauguration, can get past January 20th, which he probably can with almost any case in court, then he arguably can only be removed by impeachment.
Really? I didn't know that.
And at that point, the House and the Senate are not going to impeach him because they're controlled by his party.
Right.
So anything that happens has to happen before January 20th.
Okay.
Don't you think he was vetted pretty well when he
That's-
went to his Senate?
I would.
See?
Yeah.
No?
No.
Now, one of the things that there's a widespread myth, I guess you call it. I can't say that it's really supported by much, but everybody seems to have this notion that one reason why libertarians don't do better. They think that Democrats and Republicans vet their candidates. They don't.
They don't. Right?
Well, the government would vet their candidates, wouldn't they?
No.
No.
Not necessarily.
No, the parties rely on opposing candidates to vet one another.
They would think, how did this guy get to this point if he, he wasn't on the level, I guess that's what
Yeah, well, if you want to look up something, look up the name Don Yarbrough. A real
Piece of work.
Who got elected because on the strength of his name. Yarbrough is a well-known political name in Texas. But he was nothing like the other Yarbroughs.
Uh-huh.
Whatever else you might think about the other Yarbrough, he was definitely not in their league. Yet he got elected. So, but nobody was watching. Nobody was minding.
Uh-huh.
One of the main things the libertarians have going for them is that on every ballot, there has to be a choice of none of the above. There is no such rule for the other two main parties. If only one guy files for the nomination, he's going to be the nominee.
Right.
There may not be anybody in the party who knows who the heck he is. May be totally unknown to any of them.
Could use that to your advantage.
So one of the things that libertarians need to do is to dispel this notion that the two major parties vet their candidates.
It was interesting. I didn't know that.
That's your
Yeah.
fault. But the only way we vet them is by listening to them for a while, and then
Yeah.
you can pretty much get a handle on
Well, that's basically all of the other parties
Yeah.
do too. They listen to people for a while, or maybe they don't.
them.
Most of our candidates in the recent election, we didn't. I've never met most of them. They just, Wes Benedict went out and recruited people, and maybe he knows them, but I don't. The rest of us don't either. They don't show up at meetings.
Yeah.
So, well, now Bill Strange is going to be at the next SLEC meeting.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, when is that? Because I'm going to ask Pat Dixon to put me on that committee, or I'm going to volunteer for it.
Okay, well,
You're already on it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We haven't settled on a date yet, but January 10th or 20th looks like good days.
Okay, so I'd ask you to speak for me.
Well, you
in
have
that
to
regard.
represent.
I do. I am. I heard I'm in the 25th Senate District,
Yeah.
and I want to build the Libertarian Party in my district,
Okay.
in the counties. And I was told by Rock Howard, because he already laid some groundwork, saying that would be the way to do it. To be a.
Well, the thing is, if you could show up at the next meeting and give me some background information on you,
Okay.
I'll nominate you.
Okay. What do you want to know?
Well, basically your history with the party. At this point, it's already known, but
Yeah.
we need to remind everybody.
Yeah, and all, it's, I can't even do this. Yeah, here's my bio. But my history of the party, I was pissed off and contacted Wes, and he invited me to a meeting, and the way I was talking, they gave me a shot at the caucus, and I won.
What pissed you off?
The two-party system, the way the country's going, and the Constitution being ignored, and then I do realize the Republic is in crisis. Somebody needs to stay. We've got to do something.
Why isn't it bothering anybody, everybody else though?
Well, it is bothering them, but they don't know what to do about it, I don't think.
Yeah.
I really think
They're waiting for somebody to give them an order.
that
Right.
exactly, that they, or somebody to step up and explain it to them in such a way that would cause them to think of how serious it is. Right now, the most serious thing on most people's mind is, do you think UT can be #1 in the nation again, or how are the Aggies doing?
Right.
Come on, people. I'm interested in that too, but the Rome's burning.
Right, right.
Well, I think it'll become very apparent in the months and years ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Well, can I
If we play things right and are successful, this could be the turnaround.
I hope so, because I heard a pundit say this week that maybe that's why McCain didn't try so hard, because, nobody wanted him on the Republican side, so just to make it easy for Obama to be the president, because there's no way he can save this thing. Do you kind of agree with that?
Yeah.
There's no way.
I kind of have a feeling the Republicans might have
That's
been
accurate.
loose, yeah.
Yeah, and that's scary too.
But I guess I wanted to say at the same time, people are looking for direction. They have their own set. People have their own set political opinions. People are very exact, and it's hard to, convince them of anything.
Yeah. Well, everybody has an idea of what the Constitution does. They think they're free.
Right.
It's the boiling frog thing. The water's boiling, and you've been in there so long you don't notice it.
That's very. Yeah.
So we've got to.
Well, the other thing too is that most people don't personally feel the effects of the loss of freedom.
Exactly. It's slowly
It's
Right.
down the
It
road.
mostly affects other people, and they don't worry about it as long as
The standard of living in this country is actually pretty good. I mean, if you compare it. I mean,
Well, even our poor have air conditioner and flat screens.
Yeah, that is likely
Right.
not to last.
Yeah.
right.
The people from Argentina, one in particular named Furfall, his handle, describes students coming to class being unable to pay attention. They look like normal middle class people. They're dressed well, and they're getting around and all that, but they can't pay attention because they haven't had anything to eat.
Yeah, they're so damn hungry they can't.
Wow.
Yeah,
They got that bad, huh?
yeah.
Because I had heard about that, but I didn't know that it
Yeah.
was sustained.
So you can have starvation all around you and not really realize it.
Right. Everyone's dressed nice, but there's no food, right?
Well, we're kind of being starved my own self by the
Well,
way we eat. The way we eat
Right.
is we're not getting the nutrition that's we really should.
Well, one of the problems I think that's going to be solved in the next few years is going to be the problem of obesity.
Well,
I'm down 25 pounds already.
good.
That's great.
Amazing what eating right will do for you.
Yeah, that is
And
it's a known
and
fact.
one of the things I am fond of emphasizing, no matter how bad things get, keep your sense of humor.
There you go.
We might be in a graveyard, but at least we can crack graveyard jokes.
Yeah. Well, life's a big pendulum, I believe. I mean, it swings this way and that way, but I'm pretty sure the sun's coming up tomorrow.
Right. That's true.
Or if
So-
not tomorrow, then someday.
Yeah, sooner or later.
It's not bad all
Okay,
the time.
well,
Okay.
I need to get home.
Man, where did
and get ready to leave, so push the red button.